Okay, Mitch, do you hear us? Hello, hello, test, test.
Hello?
Hello, hello. 3 seconds and then we are starting.
Okay, good.
Hello everybody, this is Sparta Live. Sparta is a lecture and workshop program at the Art Academy Düsseldorf. This is our first lecture for this semester.
Today we are very pleased to welcome the artist and writer Mitch Speed here.
Thank you. It's very, very nice to be here. It's incredibly lovely and valuable to have opportunities to
speak with people in general, but in other cities, and interesting people in other cities. In this really pent-up time that we're all in, I guess everybody probably feels that way. So, but in particular, I'm very, very happy to have been invited. Thank you, Till and Swinda, for that, and thank you everybody who's joined. It's appreciated, and it'll be nice to talk to you later in the sort of roundtable discussion that we have afterwards. I'm going to give a talk, which is, as you can see, I think, entitled "Things I'm Not Talking About," and I'll try everything. Everything's okay. Okay. I'll try to keep the preamble short so that we have lots of time just for the talk, and also for the discussion afterwards, which I really hope will be a discussion. The subject of this talk basically is sort of the tradition or sub-tradition, if you want to call it that, of artists who also write, which on the one hand seems like a really obvious topic, and maybe it is, but as I started sort of developing the essay that led to this topic, I realized that actually it's a subject that, although it's very, very common, so many artists are now expected to write, whether it's academically in school or to write statements and stuff like that, is rife with material, rife with sort of subjects to dig into, basically, in terms of the anxieties of that plague the relationship between art and writing, and so on and so forth. It's a personally grounded presentation lecture, because this is a position that I find myself in. I think above all, what I kind of want to do with this talk is open up, maybe not new ground, but certainly fresh ground through which we can sort of consider the relationship between producing writing and producing artwork. So something other than the kind of academicized sort of rhetoric of interdisciplinarity, which I think is very, very well meant, but can be as stifling as it is liberating or productive. And art criticism, so sort of thinking about ways in which writing by artists contributes in important ways to the way that we conceive of art's meaning, basically. With that, I'll get going. It's a written talk, so I'm going to be reading. Feel free to come and go, and then we can have a dialogue afterwards. A couple of years ago, I was reading an essay by the Irish novelist Colm Tóibín. Eventually, he gets around to talking about why artists write. Tóibín's insight was simple, but it floored me. He wrote, "Creating space for your own work involves creating space for the work that made a difference to you. This is why artists write essays. They do so to reposition the way we read or the way that we respond so that the work they do can be read or seen more clearly. It is the same reason, if there is a reason, that plants grow towards light." This is about as good as an explanation as I've heard for why artists should write. By the time I read this essay, comme Toibin's essay, I'd been struggling for years with the problem of holding both an artist and a writer inside of one body. It was a feeling of split identity. So I lodged Toibin's insight into my memory, and there it became a wayfinder, a reminder. Writing probably has to be triggered by an urge, a compulsion, an itch. And the truth is, as much as I recognize what Toibin says as true, I'm not sure if this is why I started writing about art. I think I started writing about art because it feels good. To put a slightly finer point on that goodness, writing was, oddly enough, a way to escape thinking. It was a way to outstrip the crazed interior monologue that had, in certain situations, begun to devour me. I'll just pause for a second, ask if it's clear enough.
To me, it was clear. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
No questions so far. Thanks.
Great. This talk isn't going to present a set of answers about writing. Certainly, it should not be mistaken for a plan of action. Instead, it is really a turning up of the soil, an agitating of the complicated and often anxious distance that at once separates and connects writing and artists. What I'm going to do, in addition to telling you what, why, and how I do what I do, is list artists and talk about their different approaches to writing. Really, I'm writing this because I want to understand the different effects that these ways of doing have for the relationships that we develop with art. No new trails are being blazed here. There is a proud tradition of writing by artists, even if it sometimes seems that it has been swept under the carpet of authoritative art history and art criticism. I'd like to start with an artist whose work was visceral, connected to underground culture, and at the same time, radically cerebral. Mike Kelley was incredibly adept at integrating writing into and alongside his work. Writing as an artist, Kelley was all too aware of the prejudices and anxieties that torment writing artists, sometimes to the extent of shutting them up completely. Conveying this understanding, Kelley wrote, this is in quotations, "Of course, there is a long tradition of writings by artists. It could almost be considered a literary genre. But these writings are suspect because their authors are both objects and subjects of the critical discourse, and must therefore be prejudiced." Put another way, to write as an artist, especially to write criticism of other artwork as an artist, can appear like a bald-faced conflict of interest. I suppose that's true. But it is only true in an environment where the writing artist is the exception to the rule. If more artists would write about the work of their peers, and if criticism was not considered so reflexively to be the job of professional critics, this conflict would simply become the norm. I'm running through probably obvious slides of Mike Kelley's work in the background here, and covers of some of his books. There are as many ways to write about your own art and the art you care about, or even the art you hate, as there are ways to make art in the first place. If you ask some people, there are just as many reasons to avoid hitching your work in the studio to the written word. I once heard from a friend that the New Yorker magazine's art critic Peter Sheldall had advised an MFA student to stop writing immediately. If artists felt an urge to write, the suggestion went, they should slap themselves on the wrist, knock that inkwell to the floor, watch the black liquid spill away. Thus, a distraction from the real work of being an artist, the work that goes on in the studio, would be destroyed. Sheldall's point was that the artist should stay focused on their real work, making things for others to interpret, contextualize, and hopefully experience. But there have been so many other perspectives articulated on this matter, often from the position of very, very good artists, that it's hard to take his admonition seriously. Back to Mike Kelley just for a moment. This is what he had to say about his decision to start writing as an artist. I decided to write about my own work. I decided I had to write about my own work if my concerns were to be properly conveyed. Also, I was not pleased with how contemporary art history was being constructed. So I felt it was my duty to raise my voice in protest and write my own version, whenever I could. In a sense, then, much of my writing was reactive. It never truly seemed that the decision to write was my own. For Kelley, this project of taking control of the framing of his work, and in the process resisting a canon of art history that he felt was elitist and limited, was not only self-complimentary. He evidently knew better than to simply blow smoke up his own ass. He knew how he wanted his art to be seen, but he was also self-aware and critical of the privileges he enjoyed in terms of his ability to create a world for himself through art and writing. Of this world, he wrote, "This is my ivory tower. I am Rapunzel. My hair immediately grows to floor length whilst I pluck a lute and blow panpipes. Yes, my corn silk colored tresses stream down the tower's side like cum down a masturbated phallus. It stands erect and alone, my ivory tower." You can see from this passage how Kelley's painfully self-aware, performatively deranged ethos bled into the writing. For him, the project of writing as an artist was not only analytical or expository. Writing was also a medium in his repertoire. A few minutes ago, I made reference to pen and ink. I'm aware that this sounds absurd, out of time, quaint. But in talking about pens and ink and paper, I'm trying to alert you both to the dubiously romantic position that I'm coming from, and also the material reality of writing, over and over and over again. For the past years, I have written not only to frame my own work and that of my peers, but also to survive. It is how, piece by piece, commission by commission, essay by essay, I make a living. Throughout this process, I have spilled a lot of literal ink over literal paper. Those tools have become a kind of survival mechanism. For me, it is simply the case that these old-fashioned materials with their old-fashioned sensuality ease the stress of writing. Impressing ink into the page feels good. It feels warm. It feels mythological. And in feeling all of these ways, it feels safe. Speaking of the material conditions of writing, there is a good essay by the artist Francis Stark called "The Architect and the Housewife." Stark's work, which often includes writing, and was enormously influential several years ago and continues to be very good. She had a show at Buchholz in Berlin not long ago. Although she has made drawings, performed and produced videos and collages, Stark has often insisted that she is first and foremost a writer. I was attracted to this position because it seemed like a way to take the pressure off of the act of art making itself. Stark's insistence on being a writer, even as she was primarily known as an artist, offered a way in which the storm of thoughts and ideas that often get in the way of making art, jamming up the pipes as it were, could be dumped into this other form called the essay. It seems to me that any artwork or art practice can only hold so many ideas at once. If you try to push everything in, the system just backs up, floods, becomes dysfunctional. For us busy minds, you need another repository to put the rest of those ideas. When collected in essay form, those ideas can feed the work in a more subtle way, like content dripping into waking life from the unconscious. In The Architect and the Housewife, which unfolds in the first-person form, Stark's thoughts have a lot to do with what it means to be an artist and the vocation's material realities. In her case, this reality has to do with being a woman. She writes about working within social constructions of domesticity, but also the most literal construction of domesticity, which is the home, the house. In this essay, the artist finds herself influenced by the capitalist pressure to perform as a domestic consumer. This desire coexists in an unsettled relationship with the need to make art. What I mean by that is she writes in this essay about going to shop for pillows and stuff like that, houseware. I mean, she weaves anecdotes like that into very kind of like serious considerations of her artwork specifically. Stark observes that her male friends have been socialized to consider their own work on the scale of architects big, big, big. In contrast, she feels that the culture has cordoned her own work within the smaller and often hidden realm of the home. Hence the title of her essay. She associates her artistic labor with that of the housewife. While reading Stark's description of the housewife's invisible labor, I think of the work of my often female copy editors, as much as being an opportunity to reflect the meanings of one's art or the struggles associated with making it. Writing professionally is a process of constant communication and negotiation with other very lowly paid workers. People, often women in my experience, who do the diligent and extremely labor-intensive work of cleaning up commas, periods, and semicolons. In any case, if we want to understand how Stark went about integrating writing into her work so effectively, it's helpful to take a closer look at her method. She begins by doing exactly what artists are not supposed to do. She is almost ridiculously direct about her intentions. She doesn't let the viewer slowly find their way into the work. Stark's essay is interwoven with very, very subjective descriptions of her life. In this way, the writing seems linked to the tradition of so-called confessional writing, mostly associated with female and feminist writers, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, etc. But if Stark's candid voice reflects this tradition, it also reflects her broader reading. It was Oscar Wilde's essay, The Critic as Artist, she writes, that gave her the go-ahead to be myself in this piece. That being myself doesn't only refer to talking about one's own life literally. It also refers to reflecting on the page the seemingly ridiculous stream of consciousness thought process that transpires inside one's head. To me, this is important, as one thing I've learned about writing is that it often begins in the most happenstance, almost stupid way. You just have a thought and then you follow it to another thought. In my experience, it is very often the unwillingness to trust this process that prohibits people from writing. For her part, Stark begins by matter-of-factly telling us how the essay began. The word housewife, along with its sexist implications, popped into her head, and she just followed it. Of course, Stark's free association style also has a psychoanalytic aspect to it. She's wise to this fact and alludes to it through descriptions of her home studio and its psychological discontents. Behind her couch, we learn, there is a table on which she works. For some reason, her guests feel too nervous to sit in this couch. It seems that an ominous presence must lurk behind it. And indeed, this is true. That presence is Stark's own artwork, which she is here, somewhat bizarrely, associating with the intimidating, judgmental, authoritative power of the psychoanalyst. Francis Stark's psychoanalytic interest puts me in mind of another, earlier artist who combined writing and conceptual art to upending effect. For Mary Kelley, psychoanalysis was a methodology that could be combined with feminist and Marxist strategies in order to convey the details of personhood that had been excluded from so much art of the time. When Kelley's collected essays were published, she wrote an introduction that lucidly conveys the reasons for which and strategies through which she undertook this project of art making and writing. Kelley's essay is significant in the way that it has become a document of a time when feminist conceptual artists began integrating the evidence of bodily, sexual, and otherwise personal experience into their work. Her introduction opens by mentioning the nasty public response that met her most famous artwork of this period. The piece was called Postpartum Document and comprised an extensive series of materials and documents relating to her infant son's development. The work itself incorporated writing in the form of essayistic fragments and a bibliography reflecting on the objects presented. Soiled diapers, evidence of the child's attempt at writing, clothing, etc. After Kelley was attacked in the British tabloid press for the alleged inappropriateness of this content, she filed the newspaper articles away in a box. In the aforementioned introduction, Kelley explains how these condemnatory newspapers became a kind of repressed trauma, a trauma incurred through the experience of being shamed in public. The act of writing, she tells us, became a way of acting out this trauma. Through writing about this experience, she could take away the trauma's power. This is the kind of important insight into the psychological experiences and consequences of making art that artists' writing can give us. Kelley's interest in psychoanalysis was part and parcel with her interest in early childhood development and the mother-child relationship. Explicitly concerned with that topic, her piece also resists the erasure of these aspects of life from a patriarchal and sexist art culture. Kelley shows us the pathway by which she came to discover that her interests were not acceptable within the conceptual art milieu. She wrote, "What I had assumed to be inevitable, that interrogating the conditions of existence of the object would necessarily include the question of the subject and sexual difference, was not the case. Although there was a move to extend the analytic method beyond the exclusive parameters of aesthetics, it stopped dramatically short of synthesizing the subjective moment in that inquiry." Again, Kelley's essay is valuable not only for the history it gives us of this time. It is equally and perhaps more valuable for the light it sheds on the mechanics of how this struggle played out within an artistic process, a process that is fundamentally connected to the emotional, sexual, physical, physiological experience of being not only an artist, but also a human being. Just as Stark and Kelley were not simply obsessed with themselves, narcissism isn't the only reason that I use the first person pronoun when I write, though it may be one of them. In large part, my own use of the first person voice has been a matter of contingency. Aside from the odd art school seminar, I was not trained in critical theory or art history. This means that I have a relatively shallow well to draw on in terms of reference points. Because of this, I've had to learn how to dig into myself and my own responses to artworks in order to make the words come out. This is, I suppose, another reason that I'm sympathetic to the psychoanalytic approaches of Stark, Kelley, and others. If a person digs into their own responses to a work of art, there is ample material to work with. The trick is in making the writing that results from that exploration of the self's relationship to art seem connected to the world, connected to a reader's own experience, not hermetic, but inviting and above all worth reading. While I was writing this talk, I became overwhelmed by the amount of artists that could be mentioned, that deserve to be mentioned. And so I resolved to make a list. This is a provisional account, but I want to at least register their presence to indicate the sheer volume of good work that has occurred in this borderland between the written page and the made thing. I would have loved to talk, for instance, about Jutta Kutter's essay, Bad Dad. This essay, in turn searing and devotional, communicated Kutter's nourishing, if not entirely pleasant, relationship to her very male predecessors, in particular Sigmar Pulke, who figures as a kind of phantom father figure. Or how about Kara Walker's recent artist statements? These short, cutting texts give a weird, appropriately unsatisfied expression to the bind of catharsis and commodification that Walker finds herself in. And then there is Glenn Ligon. Ligon himself works with the pages of literature, integrating them into his own work as stenciled paintings. But he also writes in a brilliantly self-reflective way. His essay, Thomas is a Trip, about a controversial art project by Thomas Hirschhorn, shows an artist confronting a body of work with which he intuitively disagrees. But more importantly, it also shows that artist allowing that disagreement to be affected and impinged upon, allowing it to evolve. No artist's writing has obsessed me more than Moira Davies, and that, I suppose, is one reason that I'm not talking about her much here. I have read Davies' essay, Photography and Accident, over and over and over. For me, it's a model of how to convey the meaningfulness of one's efforts in writing by stringing ideas, influences, and feelings together like finely woven but never too tight nets. Her writing catches the viewer, but it still leaves room for them to participate in the encounter that follows. Another Canadian writing artist, Isabel Powell, once gobsmacked me with her writing about Liz Magor. When I read Powell's writing on Magor, its swaggeringly deferential tone was so pitch perfect that it almost derailed my own attempt to write about Magor's work. Speaking of Liz Magor, too few people know about her own early writing, in particular her essay Autoportrait. In this text, Magor performed a version of the making space that Colm Tóibín describes. She did this not by talking about other artists, but by writing about the details of clothing worn by famous women, often the wives of canonical male artists, as seen in old photographs. In this way, she drew attention, in a wry, oblique, non-hand-holding fashion, to the importance of in her own work of the metaphysical behavior of clothing, from surface to stitching to decoration. And what about Arthur Jaffa? In order to understand Jaffa's enormously popular work, it helps to listen to him speak and to read his text, My Black Death. The essay is a kind of condensation on paper of Jaffa's masterful ability to contextualize his work through speaking. Last but not least, I'll mention Hilton Al's long essay on Robert Gober, which, like so much of Al's writing, lays waste to cliches about who should identify with who and what should mean what to who and why. Al's style is so easygoing that it almost taunts you to not look deeply into it. But then insights arrive like sudden life-changing secrets. I wavered before including Al's on that list. His main contribution has been as a writer proper, a reviewer of theater, a profiler of cultural icons, an essayist of visual art. But then a few years ago, he installed a series of three art exhibitions at the Artists Institute, a small university gallery on New York's Upper East Side. I only saw 2 of these shows, wherein Alice combined his own photographs and sculptures with work by and photos of his own realm of influences, from the drag scene to black icons of football who were also sex gods. In any case, Al's shows had a certain lo-fi mysticism about them, the kind of aura that arises when you glimpse something shimmering in the space of shape-shifting, in the transition from a writerly creature into a visually artistic one. I've chosen all of these artists because of the way that they implicate themselves into their writing and work. But because I have such a strong preference for this approach, I have to remind myself that some very effective writing by artists has also been designed to push the self out of the work. One very worthwhile and very complicated example of this approach can be found in the work of R.H. Quaitman. Quaitman not only writes about her own work, but conceives the work itself as writing. Since about 2000, she has worked exclusively on small paintings produced on wood panels and always using various printing processes: silkscreen, digital printing, photography. Quaitman divides the work into series, which she calls chapters. When the paintings are installed in the gallery, they have the effect of dreamlike novels without dialogue. She uses the word book to describe her body of work in total. In using the word book in this fast and loose way, Quaitman is playing a kind of language game. It is a gambit designed to break a viewer free of their habitual understanding of what these mediums, books and paintings, actually are. The tactic is meant to jostle us loose out of our expectations for what the experience of painting or writing holds, and to reacquaint us with the experience of artworks as things that are novel and alien. Back in 2011, Quaitman made an actual book called Spine. This book gathered together chapters 1 to 20, which she had so far produced. The introductory essay to this book afforded Quaitman an opportunity to take her viewer and writer through the experiences that formed her desire to make her artwork strange. Her strategies are thus transformed from the expression of an idiosyncratic individual desire into expressions of broader historical and cultural circumstances. Specifically, these circumstances have to do with the way in which artworks are presented in different institutional and national contexts, and how those contexts either reinforce or destabilize our perception of the artworks as things that are either extremely precious, fetishized, and venerated, or mere jokes, absurdities, curiosities. For Quaitman, this revelation occurred during a trip to Russia, whereupon she saw cherished artworks from within the Western canon suddenly jarred out of context. While studying in Paris, Quaitman took a trip to St. Petersburg, where she saw the first exhibition in the Soviet Union of Western art from the last 30 years. She describes the experience, an experience that would come to feed her own techniques, like this. Amongst the works exhibited here were Andy Warhol's Brillo box of 1964 and Marcel Duchamp's bicycle wheel. While walking one day through the exhibition, I saw an old woman, a museum guard, vigorously spinning the wheel and laughing uproariously. The ready-made was stripped bare of its expensive clothing, having spun out of its Western orbit. This experience contradicted everything I assumed a public institution should be. The toilets stank and food was scarce. We were free to pull out the dusty old Maleviches in the dank storage rooms, and the guards laughed and laughed at the art. Quaitman, we learned through her writing, wants to denature the experience of art. At the same time, Quaitman's use of the book format is for her a way to shift the way in which her artwork is approached. Now the paintings would be experienced and adjudicated not only in terms of their interior content, composition, etc., but in terms of how an individual painting fits within or relates to the body of work or book as a whole. Putting this in a slightly different way, Quaitman explains that she actually wants to change the temporal conditions associated with viewing a painting. Whereas a typical painting can be viewed in a few seconds or a minute, Quaitman's book project insists on viewing the body of work as a whole, a type of viewing that, while it may not take quite as much time as reading a novel, radically extends the amount of time that a viewer needs to properly experience the work. We learn all of this not from essays written about Quaitman, but from the artist herself. There is, of course, some irony in the fact that she at once attempts to remove herself from the work and then turns around and writes about her intentions in such a direct way. But for artists, her writing offers an important insight into how you can adjust the imaginative, temporal, and cultural conditions through which your work is encountered. As a writer and a writing artist, I have uncomfortable memories of falling apart. They are uncomfortable not only because they involve a whole lot of sweating, pacing, and rapid breathing, but also because they entail a crisis of ego that I would often rather not think about. This is the reality of writing in public. For me, and I don't know if this relates to my personal background or not, there is always a degree of shame entailed in putting a piece of writing or an artwork into the world. This gesture always reminds me of my all too human will to view myself as a unique being, whose written or visualized creations are or must be, as insane as it sounds, worthy of being put on view and focused on, even for a few minutes, a few days, or a month. The shame associated with this situation is the shame of secretly wanting to experience oneself as being unique and singular. The feeling is a little bit like hearing oneself exclaim, like a needy child, "Don't you think I'm special?" Were it only the case that the desire to write or make artwork, was one free of ego, a pure expression of the desire to give others something intriguing to look at, to experience, to read. And I'm including reflections like this because as much as I'm intoxicated by the romantic mythology of the artist and the writer, I want to break that mythology so that we can all see together all of the other elements that define and shape the practice of writing and making art. For me, the worst ego breakdowns have been a result of getting things wrong. The first piece that I ever wrote for Frieze magazine, in one such memory, the first piece that I ever wrote for Frieze magazine had just been published online. It was a review of an exhibition by the Romanian artist Ciprian Mirajan that had taken place at the Neue Berliner Kunstverein. When the piece went up, I began reading my description of the work and quickly noticed that I had incorrectly described Mirajan's drawings. My face broke into a sweat and I started pacing. The piece had already gone to print, and there was nothing I could do. The embarrassment was not only over the fact that I had made a mistake and that my error had been revealed to a broad readership. It was, more to the point, a result of the ego rush that came with having a platform in a magazine, crashing violently into the realization of fallibility. Over the years, similar mistakes have happened, although I have learned to mitigate them. Still, I will admit to struggling with the ego crisis that for me at least, are intrinsic to having a public voice, even a very small public voice, as is the case when a person writes about art. I missed a little part about an essay by Susan Howe called My Emily Dickinson, or I didn't miss it. I sort of left out a little chunk for time's sake. Are we okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
So I'll just give you a very, very brief description. The poet Susan Howe wrote an incredible essay about Emily Dickinson called My Emily Dickinson, and for it's remarkable for the way in which it kind of shifts between prose, lucid prose, and Howe's own poetic mode, and in so doing, but still kind of operates as an essay about Emily Dickinson. But because it shifts in that way, it feels like one poet really communing with another. In other words, one artist really communing with another artist, rather than trying to, strictly speaking, interpret or explain that artist's work. So I say, thinking about Howe's essay leads me again to think about the relationship between opacity and clarity. The relationship between these two modes of writing is intensely divisive. There is, of course, a profoundly political dimension to clarity, in the sense that you cannot be perceived to be hiding your meaning. You are being accessible. You are inviting people in. You are relaying facts. Those are all good things. On the other hand, an uncritical devotion to clarity in writing can produce a disputation whereby writing becomes nothing more than a delivery system for information. In the context of writing about art, this kind of viewpoint risks robbing us of the ability to use writing as a way not to explain or interpret, but in fact to echo or resonate the effect of a particular artwork. There is a lot to say about this. For an excellent example of artists who have harnessed the poetic power of non-clarity in their writing, a person could do worse than to look at the writing and poetry of Ed Atkins. Atkins' writing and poetry about his own work and about the work of his colleagues is labyrinthine, free associating, and bizarre. It argues for the energy of his favorite art, not by using the written word to explain, but instead to amplify. But there are equally great examples of crystal clear writing. Chris Krause's essay collection Video Green is one of them. Many of the essays in Video Green originated in a column of Krause's called Torpor, which was published in Art Text magazine. As is characteristic of much of Krause's writing on art, the essays often begin in one place and end up somewhere radically different, even as the writing itself remains perfectly lucid. Often, the pieces do not have easily encapsulated theses. They are like chain-linked vignettes. They drift from one scene to the other. If this process of drifting from one subject to another seems to indicate a lack of clarity, it is really Krauss's way to disallow our experience of art from being siloed off from the outside world, a way to insist that the experience of art always exists in relation to or next door to life in general, in all of its social, political, and personal realities. In the introduction to Video Green, Krauss writes that she found it impossible to separate the careers and works of individual artists from the politics and values of the art world at large. I was trying in these pieces, she writes, to understand it. Reading Krauss's essay Art Collection, I realized that she is writing about other kinds of art, not from the art world per se, and not even underground, but instances of art that kind of arise independently of these worlds. One essay, for example, is based on a guy named Martin, who Krauss meets while looking for sex online. Martin buys a couch that was used as a prop in some Hollywood movies. He then watches all of the films in which his new piece of furniture plays a supporting role and constructs a montage based on scenes where the couch appears. This, for Krauss, is a type of art no less worth consideration than the landscape paintings of David Cordy, which are also mentioned. When Martin begins describing his sexual fetishes, his words themselves begin to feel like a form of art writing, albeit one focused on the art of desire and sex, rather than the art of putting objects and images in galleries. In terms of both content and structure, this is incredibly liberated writing. In the way that the writing still manages to hold together, it is incredibly accomplished. The same is true of Krauss's tone, which is perfectly balanced. She wages war against the aesthete critics of the 1990s like Dave Hickey on behalf of the heady avant-garde unfolding in California art schools. But then later she writes sensitively about obscure painters from upstate New York, giving care and respect to their almost embarrassingly transcendental ambitions. Just as Krauss's type of clear writing is not the only type of clear writing, Atkins' carefully designed opacity is not the only type of opacity. All absolutes are ridiculous, and the advice to not write at all as an artist is no more likely to produce tragic results than the pressure to write constantly. The danger of forcing artists to write was cemented in my head almost 10 years ago as I sat in a chair in the auditorium of Emily Carr University's campus. That's the art school that I went to in Vancouver, that a lot of artists from Vancouver go to. During a symposium on art writing that I'd organized with some fellow students. The speakers were a mixture of academic art types and BFA and MFA candidates bent in more writerly directions. The symposium had been fun and informative, but I'll never forget the feeling of confused sadness that rippled through the sparse crowd when listening to one MFA candidate describe how her program's research and writing requirements had swallowed the time necessary to make art. The thing is, this suffocating version of writing didn't and doesn't enjoy a monopoly on what writing by artists can do. On the contrary, writing as a magic snuffing branch of institutionalized art was and is in a state of tension with writing that does exactly the opposite, writing that opens things up, that is less a wet blanket than a breath on flame. When I think of the artists' writings that have been most important to me, I think of essays whose effect lays not in the writer's ability to academically regulate the art's meaning or situate it in a context. More so, I think of a palpable belief in the work being written about that causes the words on the page to themselves resonate like a part of the artwork orbiting outside of its body proper and sending signals back and forth as evidence of the art getting involved and in touch with the world. In this sense, I am a devotee of Susan Sontag's famous preference for an erotics over a hermeneutics of art. What I am arguing for here is that in addition to being merely capable of handling the written translation or accompaniment of artworks, artists are uniquely equipped to not only describe the formal, semiotic, or social behavior of an artwork, but to echo, by drawing on their experience on the inside, in the slimy tubes and organs of the digesting gut of art making, the rusty and oily pipes and valves of this constant but somehow beautiful half-functioning engine. What art means, as it lurches and shuttles through the awkward limbo between making and showing. In this way, writing by artists mimics my own preferred way of encountering artwork, sets an example, in fact, for that type of encounter. To experience artwork, I want to say, is not just to read its signs and messages. It is, rather, to enter into a complex type of intimacy wherein the witnessing self, the looking self, that part of us which notices, sees, and thinks, is braided with the empathizing self, that part of us that feels, or at least subconsciously tries to feel, what is in front of us from the inside out. If this compact of witnessing and feeling perspective is implicit in all written accounts, it has been drastically skewed towards the former in a written art discourse wherein writing itself is still the exception to an analytic, distanced academic journalistic rule. Well, we all know what rules are made for. I'm going to take this opportunity to shirk one expectation of good writing and give the closing sentence to someone else. This is Amy Silman reviewing a collection of essays by her colleague, the painter Carol Dunham. Silman gives another great reason for artists to write. Of Dunham, she wrote, by demanding new questions about and uses of form, Dunham's book lays down a pragmatic kind of polemic. Artists and other witches, weirdos, gumshoes, alchemists, provocateurs, and poets must take the power of language into their own hands with love and antagonism. This project is political, a way to articulate an art and ethics of multivalence, excess, contradiction, and defiance. And that is where I will leave it. Thank you. Thank you for your ears.